Medieval Life. State Standards. HS1.T.C and 1.A. Investigate how cultural perspectives, community ideas, and personal beliefs impact a theatrical work, and HS1.T.C and 1.B. Explore how cultural, global, and historic belief systems affect creative choices in a theatrical work. On your last discussion board, you responded to a prompt about whether or not you thought the religious beliefs of the majority of people should control the entertainment that was available to all people. Most students agreed that it wasn't fair for the religious beliefs, even if they are of the majority of individuals, to prevent other people from accessing certain kinds of entertainment. And you mostly agreed that in terms of preventing ourselves from seeing inappropriate content was a personal rather than a public responsibility. But I'd like you to think about whether or not your opinion changes if we're talking about law. Should the religious beliefs of the majority of citizens be taken into account when determining the laws by which all people must live? I have a few examples of things to think about before you answer that question. In the 1920s in the United States, the temperance movement succeeded in getting an amendment to the Constitution of the United States passed that prohibited the sale of alcohol. This movement was largely based in the religious belief that drunkenness is a sin, and that drunkenness had a detrimental impact on society at large. So because of the religious beliefs of the majority of people in the country at the time, no one in the country was allowed to sell alcohol. Here's another example. In 2015, the Supreme Court case Obergefell versus Hodges ruled that same-sex marriages would be recognized in all 50 states in the United States. In other words, in 2015, same-sex marriage was legalized in all 50 United States. Same-sex marriage had been illegal in a large portion of the country to one degree or another because of the religious beliefs of the majority of people in certain states. Here's a third example. In 2014, the Supreme Court case Burwell versus Hobby Lobby ruled that an employer did not have to provide birth control in their health coverage plan for their employees if birth control violated their strongly held religious beliefs, which is to say that as of that Supreme Court ruling, the commercial, profit-making world could deny people access to basic health care like birth control because of the religious beliefs of the owners of the corporation. When you respond to this discussion, what I'm asking is, do you believe that it is right that religious belief should be taken into account when determining laws that will affect all citizens within a society? I ask you that discussion question because there was a period in history where religious belief did not just impact the law that affected all individuals in a society, it was the law. This period of history was known as the Dark Ages. Rome fell, the Roman Empire fell apart in 476 AD, and by the year 600, the Roman Empire had totally collapsed. This threw Europe into a period known as the Dark Ages, or the medieval period. This is a period marked by political unrest. Power changed hands almost constantly. Tribes and countries were fighting for control of lands and resources, and because of this, the people had two places that they could turn for any semblance of a stable government. Those two places were the church and the fief. We're going to start by talking about the fief. The fief is part of something called the feudal system, which works like this. In the feudal system, God is believed to be at the very top of the pecking order. It was believed that God would ordain someone to rule, and that their power and privileges were God-given. This is called divine right. Again, the belief that a king is chosen by God and all of his power and privileges are God-given is called divine right. This makes the king in charge of everything, but this is a period during which messages could take days to travel by rider on horseback. There was no such thing as the postal system, and certainly there was no such thing as the telephone or the internet. So messages had to travel by messenger, and often that messenger was on horseback. Even at top speed, it could take days for a message to leave the king and reach its intended recipient. So to make ruling the country more effective, the king would divide his kingdom into large tracts of land, and each tract, or fief, was ruled by a nobleman. Remember, a nobleman or a noble is someone who has a title, like baron or lord, and that title grants them authority over a piece of property. In this instance, that noble, that baron or lord, had power, political power, over a fiefdom. In return for their power, the baron was required to pay homage and fealty to the king. Homage and fealty means that the baron or the lord was expected to rule the fief according to the king's wishes, providing troops for any wars and collecting taxes. Control of fiefdoms was passed from father to son through heredity. In order to control a fiefdom, either you had to be appointed to that control by a king, or you had to be born the firstborn son of the ruler of that fiefdom. This means it was not possible to ascend to power. You couldn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make a better life for yourself during this time period. You were born into your station in life. Otherwise, you would have to raise an army to overthrow your ruling class. But the fief was still a very large piece of land, so barons and lords would subdivide that land again into counties, and these counties would be ruled by knights. Knights were the lowest level of nobility. They were in charge of raising soldiers to defend the land from enemies. The noble class is only a small percentage of the society of the time. The lowest level of society was a peasant class, known as either serfs or villeins. The serfs and villeins would work the land in exchange for protection from invasion, protection from being conquered by an unkind or abusive other ruler. These people were completely dependent on the protection provided by the feudal systems. Serfs were not slaves, but they did not own their property. They rented. Everything they had, from the land that they lived on to their tools to their clothes, belonged to the fief, which meant it belonged to the king, which ultimately meant that people believed everything they had belonged to God. Serfs worked in a trade in which they were raised. As a young person, you would learn your father's trade, and that would be your job, at least if you were a boy. Ladies, you were expected to get married, have babies, and keep house. Sometimes, if you had a lot of siblings, you could become an apprentice to someone in another trade. Your education would start as soon as you were physically strong enough to start doing that job. A tailor's apprentice who would make clothing might start when he was 7 or 8. A carpenter's apprentice, which requires a little more strength, might start at 11 or 12. Your education was entirely focused on learning your trade. As a result, most people could not read or write. As a serf, you paid high taxes to your overlords, to your knight, who would then turn around and pay those taxes to the baron, who would then turn around and give that tax money to the king. As a serf, this meant you had to work very hard to earn enough to pay your taxes. A king might decide to build a road running through the kingdom, and so he needs money to pay the builders, feed horses, buy materials, etc. Let's say the king, to build this road, levies a tax of $20 per citizen to pay for the road. He tells his barons to collect that tax. But the baron wants to skim a little off the top. Now, he can't cheat the king out of his money. So what does the baron do? He raises the price so that the king still gets his $20 per citizen, but the baron can take a cut as well. So instead of telling all of his citizens, hey, the king needs $20 per person, the baron says, hey, the king needs $30 per citizen, and that extra 10 goes right in the baron's pocket. So the baron turns around and tells his knights to collect the taxes. The knights have the same idea as the baron, and so they raise the taxes to $40 per citizen. The knights dispatch their sheriffs to collect the taxes, and the sheriffs have the same idea, so the sheriffs demand $50 in taxes from each citizen, and there's nothing the serfs can do about it. If you couldn't pay your taxes, you would go to jail, and your family's business assets would be seized and sold off, which meant your children would likely be turned out to starve. So to make sure you could pay your taxes, you worked as much as you could each day that you could. That left very little time for entertainment. The one major source of entertainment you did indulge in was going to church, partly because it was illegal to be anything other than a Christian. The problem was, during the Dark Ages, the church was a very different type of organization than what we would recognize today. Today, when we think about churches, we think about congregations of people who come together to worship, to learn about their religion, and to do service work in their community. But the medieval church was nothing like modern churches. During this period, Catholicism was the only legal major religion, and they were focused more on ruling the people than helping them. Pagan religions had been outlawed, but the church still had to fight against people practicing pagan religions in secret. Because of this, the Catholic Church convinced governments to allow it to make its own laws and enforce them. When you rebel against the laws of the state, you're called a criminal. If you rebel against the laws of the church, you're called a heretic. And the church was able to punish you however it saw fit. The crimes of a heretic could be punished by torture and even execution. The church passed many laws against secular entertainment. Secular is a word that means worldly or non-religious. Because of this, theater all but disappeared between the year 600 AD and the year 1000 AD. The irony is, when theater finally returned to Europe, it was the Catholic Church that brought it back.